how the Pullman Strike of 1894 almost broke the United States. Most people remember the Pullman Strike as a labor dispute, but the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. Imagine losing nearly half your paycheck while your landlord is also your boss, and your boss is one of the richest men in America. Entire families were trapped inside a system designed to look perfect from the outside while quietly crushing the people holding it together. And once workers finally pushed back, the fallout didn't just shake railroads, it exposed cracks in the entire country. George Pullman had built an empire on luxury sleeping cars since the 1860s, crafting rail travel for the elite while employing thousands in his company town of Pullman, Illinois, a place he designed as a model of order just south of Chicago. And by 1894, after years of economic boom turning to bust, he went on record defending wage cuts of up to 40% for his 5,800 workers, cuts he refused to apply to his own dividends, describing a system that wasn't just under pressure, but completely redlined, and then pushed past that limit. And when workers with families to feed started organizing, not retiring, not transitioning, but straight up striking, it told you this wasn't a small problem, it was a structural breakdown. These were once the gold standard of working class jobs in America, the kind of careers that came with steady wages, company housing, and a level of stability that made them something families passed down through generations. But now, those same positions were seeing people leave faster than the company could hire, and even worse. The replacements often didn't last long enough to finish a shift once they realized what the job actually demanded in 1894. To understand how it got here, you have to go back to one idea that looked efficient on paper but changed everything in practice, something called the company town model, developed and aggressively implemented by George Pullman, a man who started in the industry back in the 1850s, doing hands-on carpentry and eventually rose to run his own railcar monopoly. And by 1880, when he founded the town of Pullman, he pushed this concept that workers should live in a controlled utopia, paying rent to his company for everything from homes to churches, which sounds logical until you see how he used it. What the Pullman model turned into wasn't just a housing strategy, it became a cost-cutting machine where high rents meant lower take-home pay, no independent stores meant monopoly pricing, and total control over daily life meant slashing worker autonomy. And every single one of those changes made investors very happy, because efficiency in this context really meant doing the same amount of work with fewer rights. Between 1893 and 1894, amid the panic of 1893 depression, Pullman's company slashed wages by 25 to 40% across its workforce while keeping rents fixed and refusing rent relief, affecting over 5,800 employees who saw their average weekly pay drop from $2.70 to as low as $1.30 after deductions. And they didn't do this during a collapse in demand alone. They did it while railcar orders held steady from core clients, meaning that 100% of the workload stayed on families suddenly expected to survive on 60 to 75% of prior income. And that gap didn't get filled with better systems or more support. It got filled with evictions, hunger, and constant pressure. A worker named Thomas Heathcote, a key organizer who'd spent years in the shops, summed it up in a way that hits hard because it's so simple, testifying to the U.S. Strike Commission that it was already tough to feed a family before. But now, with rents eating 30% of slashed wages, workers were expected to cover that missing income, not most of the time, but all the time. And that difference completely changed what the job felt like. Pullman workers often lived under what was called the model town lease, which sounded progressive but basically meant you're on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for any shop demand, and when the foreman called your name, you had about 30 minutes to show up, no matter if it's the middle of the night, a Sunday sermon, or a moment that actually matters in your personal life. And there's no real flexibility built into that system. It's not like negotiating time off at a normal job, because for most of Pullman history, workers had zero bargaining power, literally zero, So if you got injured or your kid fell ill, you had to either beg for charity from the company or just go to work anyway. And that level of rigidity is something most industries moved away from decades ago. Things escalated even further in May 1894 when 4,000 Pullman workers walked out en masse, forming the American Railway Union under Eugene V. Debs, which turned solidarity into a kind of national wave where sympathizers across 27 states and 6,000 miles of track refused to handle Pullman cars, even if it meant losing their own jobs. And if that action fell on a holiday or peak freight day, the economic penalty was even harsher, and once boycotts spread, so did federal troops. The only way to earn back your standing was by crossing picket lines for 30 consecutive days without interruptions. And remember, these weren't predictable shifts. They were 12 to 14-hour marathons that could start at any time depending on rail traffic. So what you end up with is a system where workers were effectively punished for being human, for standing together, for having families, for needing dignity. Now here's where it gets even more frustrating, because you might assume that companies push workers this hard when they're struggling financially, when margins are tight and survival is on the line. But that's not what's happening here at all, because Pullman Palace Car Company was among the most profitable rail firms in the country. At the height of the strike, Pullman's personal fortune stood at $25 million, over $800 million today, with the company paying steady dividends to shareholders while claiming it couldn't afford wage relief or rent cuts. And that disconnect is what pushed workers to their breaking point. By July 1894, the strike had paralyzed 80% of U.S. rail traffic, idling 125,000 sympathizers after years of ignored grievances, with one of the main demands being something incredibly basic: the right to fair rent matching wage cuts without risking eviction. And when federal injunctions failed, President Cleveland sent 12,000 troops and marshals at railroad lobbying, crushing the strike with 30 deaths, 700 injuries, and $80 million in damages, about $2.5 billion today. That moment broke a lot of trust in a way that numbers alone can't fully explain. After that decision, the prediction was that workers would start leaving in large numbers. And that's exactly what happened, because people who had been holding on, hoping for better conditions, realized the system wasn't going to change fast enough, and organizers like Debs, who valued dignity more openly, started pushing broader labor reforms that drew people away from rail work. The problem is, these aren't easy jobs to replace, because it takes months just to train a car builder and years to master sleeper assembly. And when experienced workers left, they took with them decades of knowledge that you can't just write down in a manual, especially knowledge about handling custom builds, navigating shop hazards, or making split-second fixes in tight deadlines. Even regulators started raising concerns, with the U.S. Strike Commission warning in 1895 that crushing unions compromised long-term stability by increasing desperation and the risk of future unrest, which is a serious statement when you consider the scale of what's at stake. Because these weren't small shops, these were massive operations building cars that carried America's commerce every single day. At the same time, industry leaders acknowledged morale was at an all-time low, with reports that the rail network itself was approaching a breaking point due to boycotts and constant operational chaos. There have been some small improvements, like certain railroads beginning to offer limited grievance boards under public and union pressure starting in 1895, but those changes haven't addressed the core issue, which is that the system was redesigned to maximize control in a way that stripped away the human element, cutting real living wages by 30 to 40%, while expecting the remaining families to absorb that loss indefinitely. And when you combine that with rigid leases, strike-crushing troops, and a lack of control over your own home, it's not hard to see why people chose to leave, even from jobs that once defined progress. Right now, post-strike, Railroads were hiring constantly, trying to rebuild a workforce that's been shrinking for years. But the math wasn't working in their favor, because for every 5 strikers blacklisted, only about 2 new immigrants were entering the field. And even among those new hires, a significant number walked away once they understood what the job really required. That creates a cycle where shortages lead to more pressure on remaining workers, which leads to more people organizing, which makes the shortages even worse. And that loop doesn't fix itself without fundamental changes. And the most concerning part is what happens when the people responsible for operating these systems start to feel completely disconnected from their work. Because when workers openly said morale is so low that pride in the job is disappearing, that's not just a labor issue, it's a national issue. Because these are the people responsible for building the cars, coordinating the networks, and preventing disruptions that could halt the entire economy. So when you see a train passing by, something that looks routine and almost invisible in daily life, it's worth remembering that behind that moment is an industry dealing with 40% wage cuts, $25 million fortunes amid depression, 12,000 troops deployed, 0 real sick leave for much of its history, and a system that many workers felt pushed them to the edge, because none of this happened by accident. It happened through a series of decisions that prioritized control and profit over sustainability and people. Now, what you think about all of this, because on one hand, you have an industry that powered America's growth, and on the other hand, you have workers striking nationwide and new hires refusing to stay. So do you think this is something that could have been fixed with better policies and pressure, or had the system gone too far in one direction to easily come back? And if you made it this far, drop your thoughts below. And if you want more deep dives like this that actually break things down without the usual fluff, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more coming.